You are listening to Over and Back's Basketball Mysteries of the 1970s. Today's mystery is, has anyone carried a great team like Kareem did? All right, welcome to Over and Back. I am Jason, with me as usual is Rich, and we are going to talk about the 1970s Milwaukee Bucks, and specifically how much of an impact Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had on carrying that great team, and whether anyone has carried the weight of a great team like Kareem did.
Yeah, and of course, you'll get into that here in a little bit, but I mean, the team made a vast improvement, adding Kareem to the fold, of course. In his second year, they ended up winning the NBA championship, just continued to just rise in terms of wins. Spearheaded, almost entirely by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, one of the best players of all time going in there. But for the purposes of this question, I kind of wanted to look at, has a great team. So you said, has anyone carried a great team like Kareem did? So to do this, I looked at teams with 10 plus simple rating system, which is on Basketball Reference. If you want to look it up to see what it kind of uses, but we'll use it a lot here. But go to Basketball Reference if you're not quite sure what it is or you want to know a little bit more about it. So I looked at teams that had 10 plus SRS all time. There's not that many. I also picked out, there's a lot of teams that did in consecutive years, like last year's Warriors and this year's Warriors did it, and like the Bucks this year and then the next year did it, and then a few different of the Bulls teams, the title teams. What I did is I basically, anytime that they did it in consecutive years, I just kept the highest one so we can get kind of an idea, because for the most part, I mean, those teams are kind of the same thing. I mean, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen were on both. There's no need to really look at both of them. It's the same sort of dynamic each time. So to get you an idea, the 71 Bucks, Kareem accounted for 27% of their total points, 30% of their the team's total rebounds. He played 40 minutes per game, and his 22.3 win shares, which is just an astronomical number, was 10 more than his closest teammate, which was Oscar Robertson. So you look at that, definitely, almost 30% of their total points, 30% of the rebounds, and 22.3 win shares. It's just incredible numbers. The 96 Bulls, Michael Jordan accounted for 29% of their team's total points. He played 37 minutes per game, and his win shares, which were 20.4, they were about 8 over his next closest teammate, who was Scottie Pippen. So as we can see, he accounted for more of their total points, but his win shares were about 2 under Kareem, and similar to that, Scottie Pippen was 8 as opposed to Oscar Robinson, who was 10 away from Kareem. They're the 72 Lakers. They're a team that had 10 plus SRS, but they're really hard to put this team into contention for the question that we're asking, because it was very much a team led by 2 or 3 guys. You have West and Wilt, and
Gail Goodrich.
Gail Goodrich. I mean, there's just too many guys. I mean, they're a team that's well known despite those guys, but despite those stars, they're well known as a team that kind of did it with multiple guys. So I kind of threw them out here. They don't really work. The 2016 Warriors, yes, not the team that won the title, but this prior team, or this year's team rather, they're a big 3, but they're very much led by Steph Curry. I mean, Steph Curry is what kind of makes that whole thing go. He accounted for 25% of his team's total points, and his 17.9 win shares were only 6 above the next closest, which is Draymond Green at 11. So again, we see still Kareem the farthest distance in win shares between him and the second best player. 2016 Spurs, surprisingly a team that pops up here a lot, that people will, I think, historically forget how great this team was because they just weren't in the NBA Finals or whatnot. But Kawhi Leonard, his 13.7 win shares were only about 2 above the next closest teammate, LaMarcus Aldridge. So I kind of take them completely out of there. They're, again, a team that was kind of led by a bunch of different people, which is kind of the Spurs way a lot of times. And then the last team that we had is the 92 Bulls. They're much different than the 96 Bulls in a lot of ways. Jordan accounts for 27 of its team's total points, but his 17.7 win shares are only 3 above his next closest teammate. And you're probably thinking it's Scottie Pippen, but nope, it is Horace Grant.
Yeah, wow, that's
little known fact that Horace Grant is the second, and that 92 Bulls team is like, I would almost count that as one of, like, of course you have the 72 and 10 team, but that 92 Bulls team is awesome. Like, they are so good and just at everything. That's when they really kind of got it with that entire offense and defense just working out real well. And a lot of it is that Horace Grant is the second best player per win shares on that team. Which, if you watch Horace Grant, you forget how great that guy was and how much he fit in that system. But yeah, surprising that he was the second best teammate on that team as opposed to Scottie Pippen. So when you look at that, there's other ways we're going to look at it, but it might be, I mean, Kareem being 10 more than his closest teammate, 10 win shares more than his closest teammate. When we're talking about some guys, Kawhi Leonard has 13 win shares this year alone, and Wilt almost had that above the next closest player. So I would say there's a pretty decent chance that he is your answer for that question.
Yeah, I mean, There you would look at maybe like Wilt in with the 67 Sixers, although that was a very well-rounded team too. You had Chet Walker and Billy Cunningham and all those guys, Hal Greer. I mean, so there's two other top 50 all-time players there, and a guy who's definitely very close to that level as well. So the Bucks do have Oscar Robertson and Bob Dandridge, but Oscar is 32 at this point, and Dandridge is very good, but not quite at that level. So, really, honestly, you could make an argument that that Kareem was, he actually they relied even more on him as the years went by, and as Robertson got older and as their depth kind of whittled away. And that's kind of part of the reason why, even though they had such great, the 72 team that lost to the Lakers in the playoffs is like a top 5 all-time SRS team, and 73 and 74 very strong teams as well. But one of the reasons why they couldn't, get past it is they just didn't quite have enough Kareem, and he was doing so much more. And Bob Ryan talked about on a previous show, just how extraordinary Kareem was to, in that series, and to be able to take the Celtics to 7 games despite the lack of depth and the injuries that the Bucks were dealt with. It was just absolutely incredible.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the players who were on the team, some of the key players who were on the 71 team and who lasted kind of through, some of them lasted through the entire dynasty, some of them not so much. But Oscar Robertson, as we mentioned, he was still very good, averaging 19.4 points per game, 8.2 assists, and 5.7 rebounds, and 49% shooting. So he had a big drop in points per game from the year before when he still played for Cincinnati, but obviously still very good. He would start to decline some in 72, and even more so in the next couple of years. He kind of becoming like an average player by the 74 season, his final year. Interestingly enough, I did some research, and according to Tom Nasalki, who was the Larry Costello, his first assistant coach for that championship season, the Bucks actually talked to Detroit about acquiring Dave Bing, but then it was Robertson who they ended up getting. But that would be interesting. What if they're Bing not as great of a player as Robertson historically, but Bing was much younger at that point, and
right, you maybe could get a few more years out of this sort of franchise and dynasty or whatever than you got with Oscar. Yeah. So that's very interesting.
I would guess it probably worked out better the way they did it, but it's still interesting. Kind of what if Bob Dandridge, who was a second-year small forward known as the Greyhound, was a very good scorer, incredible pressure defense. He would be a 4-time All-Star, would win 2 championships and play in 4 finals in the 70s, 2 with the Bucks and 2 with the Bullets at the end of the decade. John McLaughlin, who was a 6th-year shooting guard, a great shooter. He had settled into Milwaukee after bouncing around a little bit, would play there for the rest of his career and is now their TV announcer. Greg Smith, who was a 3rd-year power forward who was undersized, like 6'5", but was an incredible rebounder despite that. He actually had like a lot of positional versatility. He even played a little point guard later in his career, which is pretty incredible to think about. Kareem loved him and was upset when he was traded after the season, felt like the team never really quite recovered from losing him. Another guy who only lasted for a year was Bob Boozer, Bullet Bob, who was close to the end of his career, was a forward. He had played with Oscar in Cincinnati, he had been an all-star, and it just was a really good, was a stout rebounder, tough player, provided, some toughness and leadership off the bench, and was another guy who they kind of got rid of maybe a little before they needed to, even though he was toward the end of the year. Maybe they could have stretched him, got another couple years out of him, and and added to that. Lucius Allen, who was a point guard who played with Kareem at UCLA and also would do so with the Lakers later. Unfortunately, untimely injuries to him would hurt his teams in 74 and 77. In 74, he slipped on a warm-up jacket just before the finals and ended up injuring his knee and was out. And then he had another knee injury in 77 that kept him out of the playoffs, where they had been very competitive against the Blazers in the regular season, but were swept by them in the playoffs. The other key guys were Dick Cunningham, who was a 3rd-year center who was nicknamed the Cement Mixer, and McLeod McElroy, who was a 7th-year small forward, very much a journeyman near the end of his career. And Robertson talked about it at a NBA.com profile, talked about how, the Bucks did something really foolish. They traded Greg Smith, Bob Boozer, and Dick Cunningham. You were people who really did not understand what a team concept means. You win a championship and make a trade of any key ball player, and it's the kiss of death. Now, we all know that Oscar is sort of a complainer, so, maybe, maybe he's maybe these guys were not necessarily the end all be all there, but given that they were, they definitely had a chance to be a dynasty, and part of it was that they ran against historically great Lakers team, and part of it was they kind of slipped in some chances. 73 they lost to a much worse Warriors team. 74 they were a better regular season team than the Celtics, although with their injuries the Celtics may have been the better team actually at that point. And then Kareem, left after 75. So there's a lot of what ifs with the Bucks, even though, like I said, they had one of the great teams in NBA history. In fact, there's an SI.com profile after that finals, debating, calling them the greatest team in NBA history, and debating how they would have faced off against the some of the great Celtics and Minneapolis Lakers, previous dynasty teams. So interesting how they were being thought of even during that time.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So we're doing something a little different with this episode. We're going to have some previously aired footage from our Kareem in the 1970s episode, talking about the Bucks specifically, since we already broke that down pretty thoroughly there. We didn't want to repeat all that information in a new podcast. So we're giving you some of the new stuff here. You can, after the break, we'll go into that. If you just wanted to hear the entire Kareem in the 1970s episode with everything about his career in the 1970s, we'll have a link to this episode in the show notes, where you can also just go listen there if you don't want to bother with just listening to a part of it. But we think either way you want to do it, we think is good. So just stick around. Follow us on Twitter at Over and Back NBA, Facebook at Over and Back NBA. Give us a rating on iTunes and Stitcher or wherever you listen to us, and keep letting us know what you think. So on with the show. Before we get to the rest of the show, I want to tell you guys about Fast Break Breakfast. If you watch League Pass every night but aren't listening to Fast Break Breakfast, you are missing out. It's what happens when you get two musicians and a comic who are overeducated, underemployed, but share an obsession about the NBA, 90s movies, and conspiracy theories. So make sure you subscribe to Fast Break Breakfast, a podcast for serious NBA fans that is incredibly not serious. And now we are joined in progress as the ABA is trying to woo Kareem Abdul-Jabbar with $1 million check.
He has the choice between the NBA and the ABA. The ABA is definitely willing to kind of ensure that he will be able to play with the New York Nets if he decides to leave the. I don't know if the Nets necessarily had the first pick, or if they were just willing to be like, yeah, you can play with the Nets. It's fine. We're willing to do it.
Where do you want to go?
Because that was like the third year for the ABA, I think, or maybe the fourth season for the ABA, right? And getting him would have obviously been a huge coup. And basically, he and his advisors come up with a plan where, like, okay, each team gets one offer. But by this time, they'd done the coin flip in between the Suns and the Bucks, who had the same record the year before. The Bucks won that coin flip to get the first pick, and so. At this point, he says to the Bucks and Nets, okay, we'll only accept one offer from each team. There's an article sort of describing it where, and Kareem also talks about it in his first book, where he kind of talks about like the Bucks and the NBA make a good offer, and then the Nets make kind of a surprise, and the ABA makes a surprisingly disappointing offer, and then eventually like the Nets call back. It's like, no, that wasn't our bid. This is our bid, and it's higher than the NBA's bid. But at that time, he's like, well, I don't want to go back on my word. I feel like I'd be a hypocrite for doing that. So it's too late. There's thing, and then there's another story that talk about that one.
Probably know it's one of the most endearing stories that in Loose Balls, Terry Pluto's book, about so they went all out. The ABA had this big idea of, we're going to have George Mikan, who was the commissioner at the time. He's going to show up there, and he has this, quote, mythical $1 million check, and that was the big offer here. Here's this check. We got him. Kareem's coming to the ABA, or Lou Alcindor's coming to the ABA. the story, and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the story, I've read it slightly differently in different places, so I don't think it's
I'm going to go with it's true. I mean, that's the ABA, like, pretty much, if it's as ridiculous as possible, it's probably true because it's the ABA. Like only the things where you're like, that can't be real, and it's like, I don't know. It's the, like, and the ABA is one of those weird ones, too. It's almost like the Negro Leagues in that sense, where, like, stories get passed down, and because they get passed down so many times, they just kind of become true because so many people have just sort of said it and guys say it. So it's whatever. So essentially, George Mikan has this $1 million check. Apparently he just never gives it to Wilson or never talks about it. There's always, it stays in his pocket. There's stories. I mean, Bill Simmons writes he either got too nervous or forgot, or there's like, and Pluto just kind of just says like Mikan's just an idiot, and just, it's a fun story nonetheless. So essentially that the ABA probably could have gotten him if George Mikan had gotten a check out of his pocket, which just stayed in his pocket for some reason. It was in his coat pocket, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, and
is that what I said, or like his suit jacket or something like?
Now, Mikan's not even mentioned in Kareem's book, so
yeah, that's a big deal.
Yeah,
like it's only like Pluto mentions it a lot. Simmons probably grabs it from Pluto, but it's a great story nonetheless.
Yeah.
I hope it's true, right? Because it's just so perfect. Yeah. Like it's so ABA that they would be like, oh shit, like we forgot to give the check.
Right?
Like,
yeah,
like that's just perfect for the ABA. It's just a microcosm of that league. But yeah, so Kareem could have been an ABA, but George Mikan forgot the check. So,
and we wonder kind of what, like, we got a question on Twitter kind of wondering like, okay, what would have happened if the Suns had gotten the coin flip? And you kind of look at the Suns in 1970. They were, they had Gail Goodrich, who was still pretty young.
Yes.
They actually got Connie Hawkins that year, who was 27, who had been barred from the NBA because of a gambling scandal early on in his career. They had Dick Van Arsdale, they had Paul Silas, so they definitely had some talent. And then the year afterward, the year they would be 48 and 34. So they were definitely a team that was on the rise even without Kareem. So we would imagine. Now it's hard to know, like if financially they'd have been able to get Hawkins if they didn't get Kareem, but sure. But still, that's sort of an interesting what if, of course, because they were so close. And there's this in one of the many video clips you watch, you see like a Jerry Colangelo on the phone, very young Jerry Colangelo, of course, on the phone, and then getting the news that the Bucks win the coin flip, and you just the look on his face of just like, oh man, come on,
yeah.
Yeah. And there's so much luck that, of course, goes into so many choices that that lead to whether you're going to be a championship team or merely a good team, and this is one of the biggest ones. I mean, one of the greatest players ever doesn't go to your team, and it just changes your fortunes forever. I mean, the Suns actually did, they had a pretty decent run here and there in the 70s, including a finals appearance, but obviously it would have been very different if they'd have had, Kareem there. So.
It's funny. I was reading an article, and I don't know if I linked it here or in our kind of a show notes here, but I read an article not too long ago that talks about Colangelo and the coin flip, and he just like he beat himself up for years because he called heads and it was tails or whatever, and he's just like, I should have known it was tails. Like it's just like he and this is in like 2009 that they wrote it, and he was still just like yeah. Even to this day, I just wish I had said tails or whatever, because it I mean that would have been a franchise changing thing.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, because A, it's Kareem, but then B, you look at that team and you look at the talent of that team, and you kind of brought it up here, and I'm glad you brought up that point, is I never really looked at the team of everybody on that team is like 25, 26, 27, and they're a decent team. I mean, you even have like a Paul Silas when he's 25. You have, as you mentioned, Gail Goodrich, who's still super young, Connie Hawkins, who's still super young. I mean, so many good young talent, and we're talking about Hall of Famer level talents in their early. I mean, you can only imagine adding Kareem to that team.
I mean, either just before their prime or right in their prime. Yeah, of course. What if? That's always
and I mean, they still even won 50 game. They were around. They were hovered around that sort of 50 game period through most of the early 70s too.
Right,
so you
exactly.
think it's not too hard to add Kareem and say you might get a few extra wins.
You might. It's possible
with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as your center, but a few more, maybe
possible.
a few, one or two.
It's possible, yes. So he actually plays games finally for the Bucks, and they are a young, exciting team, and. I think one point that should be kind of made here, in a lot of these SI articles, there's talk of like the idea of basketball as the game of the 70s. And, definitely Alcindor is like the guy who's supposed to carry this game into the 70s, carry this, decade. He's the next great player. I mean, it's kind of some of the same hype that LeBron had when he came, into the league or what have you. I mean, as, maybe Shaq too, just some of these guys who are just like absolutely like going to be these transcendent players. I mean, Jordan, people thought he would be really great, but he didn't necessarily have like this expectation when he came in. It just took a couple of years before people realized like, oh my God,
Yeah, he wasn't going to be a cultural transformation like some of these other dudes.
Right, exactly. It's just interesting to go in with that pressure already, just being so big and so high, but he met it. I mean, and as Larry Costello, who was the Bucks coach, said like he's ahead of any rookie I ever saw. I played with Chamberlain, and when he wanted to, he could do everything: shoot, pass off, play defense, rebound, anything you wanted. But most of the time he was stationary. Russell was a great player, but he was never really a good shot. This kid is a combination. So, and that's after his first exhibition game. So in the 69-70 season, they finished with 56 wins. They fall in the second round to the Knicks, but they're, an up and coming team. As we mentioned, the franchise, this is only the franchise's second season. They had 4 rookies and 4 second-year players on that team. Basically the core players that season are John McLaughlin, Bob Dandridge, and then also Flynn Robinson and Greg Smith, neither of whom would stay all that long, while McLaughlin and Dandridge were there for, the duration of Kareem's career and even, a bit after, or career with the Bucks and even afterwards. So,
it was funny. You look at the record of that team too, and you sort of sense that it was a young team, but that they sort of got together. I mean, if you look at the kind of, they're at one point, looking here, December 10th, they were 16-13. So you kind of get an idea of, they're getting there, and then they just reel off like the last half of the season, they lose only another 10 games or whatever. So you can kind of sense and see what leads into, the future years here is that it's sort of a weird team. Kareem's kind of getting his feet wet here. It's still, and then they kind of get it, and they don't really look back for a while.
Yeah. I mean, the next year they are, they're 66 and 16. They win the NBA title, set a NBA record at the time with a 20-game win streak, basically one of the most dominant regular season and playoff teams ever. We should also talk about it a little bit before this, though. One part I just skipped over was there's another good essay article kind of talking about just as far as his stardom and his impact. With 6 games to go in the regular season, the gate receipts were more than twice the amount for the entire previous season. They were $1.2 million. And his teammate describes him as he may be the first of the 7-foot backcourt men. He can dribble and make moves that no big man ever saw before. He can bring the ball down and handle it and give you fakes, and no one his size could ever do that. And he talks about learning from guys like Nate Thurmond, who's the guy who gave him sort of some trouble when he played, and Chamberlain, who sat out for most of the season, but they played a bit in the exhibition, and then also from watching Russell. It is sort of like one of those things that it would have been if Russell just stuck around one season more, and then you would have been able to see him and Kareem play. Yeah. That just kind of would have been, that'd just be a cool thing to have video of. You can only imagine it, and maybe that's for the better, but still, it's just like one that would have been kind of a nice extra thing.
Sure, and watching these videos, I mean, we've been talking a lot about his dribble. That's not something that you initially think of, but I mean, you watch some of these videos, and one of the ones on YouTube that I saw, you see him get a rebound. And it's just so weird. And as you mentioned, we sort of assume these days it's like, oh, Anthony Davis can get a rebound and go down the floor or whatever. He's so unique or whatever. And then you see Kareem rather. He gets a rebound and just goes down the floor, and he's beating guys to the floor. And it's just like, geez, like the guy's like, 7 whatever he is, 7 foot to 7'3", whatever you want to say. And he's just like, there's guys like trying to strip the ball from him, and he's just beating them all down. He just goes and dunks it, and it's just like, wow, especially in that era, in that time where you don't see guys that big doing what he did. It's fascinating.
Absolutely. So they end up trading for Oscar Robertson before the 71 season. They also add Bob Boozer and Lucius Allen, who played with Kareem at UCLA. So those 3 guys plus Alcindor, McLaughlin, Smith, and Dandridge are basically their core players for that season. As we mentioned, one of the dominant regular seasons of all time and playoffs. ended up sweeping in the finals of the Baltimore Bullets, who were kind of overmatched that year. They only lost 2 games otherwise to the Warriors and the Lakers, and that was, of course, that was Will Chamberlain Lakers, also still Elgin Baylor and Jerry West, who had been to the finals the year before and, were one of the great teams of the late 60s and early 70s, even though they had yet to win a championship. So, very impressive. They were hoping to have a rematch against the Knicks, because this was the first year the Bucks were out west. In Kareem's first season, they were in the East. So instead of playing the Knicks earlier in the playoffs, their only chance to play the Knicks was the finals, but the Bullets managed to pull off an upset, but sort of exhausted themselves in that series. The Bullets had an injury to one of their key players, but it was Gus Johnson, I believe, and they were led by Wes Unseld, Earl Monroe as well, Jack Marin. So they had a good team, but were not. Just couldn't quite meet, like one of the most dominant teams of all time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at Kareem's stats, in that series, and they're just ridiculous. I mean, per game in the NBA Finals, 27 points, 18 rebounds, and nearly 3 assists. So not bad. pretty good. He shot a measly 60% from the field, though. So
right.
He needs to work on that. But other than that, he was pretty good. So another thing too that we didn't talk about, you look at a guy like Wilt, who his Achilles heel was always the free throw shooting. Well, with Kareem, I mean, in the early years he had a little bit of struggles, but I mean, in this season, he shoots, or in the finals rather, he shoots 76% from the free throw line. It just never was that big of an issue for him. I mean, he sort of got it from the beginning, and you look at him shoot free throws too in old videos, and it's very smooth and fluid, and it's obvious that's not the Achilles heel of this guy like it was, so much for Wilt, and was for even big men, today, the Andre Drummonds, the Dwight Howards of the world, the DeAndre Jordans, Shaquille O'Neal, obviously, but yeah, for him, not really an issue. So.
Yes. So they were the second team to ever sweep the finals. Boston did in '59. There's a sort of an interesting SI article from that series talking about like the fact that Oscar Robertson and Lou Alcindor are so, as players and personalities, they're very business-like. They attack their game with precision and coolness, just sort of like it. They kind of have a similar mentality when they play. Also, kind of talking about Larry Costello, how they they practice really hard. I'll read the quote: "The Buck practices are the hardest, most precisely mapped out in the league, much more like college workouts than those run by other professional teams." He also mentions that they have a system. They're one of few coaches with a full-time assistant coach who only has minor scouting responsibilities. Assistant coaches are still sort of a new idea in the NBA, which is kind of amazing. Apparently, the Bucks were the first team to average over 50% in shooting percentage for a season, they rated getting shots close to the basket was a very important part of what they did.
Absolutely, and they also rank number one. They have the simple rating system. Basketball Reference has that, and they're the number one team of all time at 11.91. They're ahead of the 95-96 Bulls and the 71-72 Lakers. And that, if you're not aware, it takes into account the point differential and strength of schedule. And there, you can really look, if you go back and look at that season and look at like the game logs or whatever. I mean, the point differential is ridiculous. I mean, that team was just like. Nobody was close to them. I mean, they lost games here and there, but the ones they won were just like dominant wins.
Yeah. So the day after they won the championship, May 1st, 1971, he publicly announced changing his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. 71-72 season, and they are 63-19. They're not quite as good, but they have a 1070 SRS, which is among the top 10 or so in NBA history, I believe. So it's well up there and still being among the greatest teams. But it's interesting, they had a lot of roster turnover, and one player that they that they ended up trading, who was a pretty important player in the championship season, was Greg Smith, who's also very close to Kareem, one of his best friends on the team. And Kareem wrote in his book that he just felt like, that was really disruptive to their chemistry, they traded him for Curtis Perry, who was, I guess nominally they were looking for a power forward, and Greg Smith was a little bit undersized for that position, but he was like, yeah, but he rebounded like heck. It was just kind of like one of those things that sort of starts, like, okay, there's a few divisions here, kind of things going on,
sure.
But, now, they're 63-19, but they end up losing in the Western Conference Finals to the 69-13 Lakers, who, of course, are, at that time had the, greatest regular season record of all time, and, one of the greatest single season teams of all time. That was the year that Bill Sharman took over for the Lakers, and Jerry West kind of installed a system for them for the first time, made Jerry West into more of a point guard. They got Gail Goodrich back, and he filled in at shooting guard, so they were just like all the pieces kind of fell in. Everyone kind of knew their role, and they were, just at least for that season, better than the Bucks. But the Bucks did end up winning ending their 33-game winning streak. And it's kind of I don't know how much of you were able to kind of watch that game, but it was sort of a fascinating game to watch.
Yeah, it was. No, I watched not as much as I would have liked. I'm actually going to go back after this and watch the rest of it. But no, I watched little bits and pieces and little clips. But it's a very, very interesting game. And you could tell that, like, from the players' demeanors and everything. I mean, you watch a lot of older and without context, it's kind of hard. But knowing the context of this game and knowing, what was on the line, you could tell that everybody is really just amped up. And the crowd's amped up. Like, everybody, I mean, I can only imagine being there live and watching that. It had to be fascinating.
Yeah.
I remember something similar. I mean, I went to a Bulls game when the Miami Heat were on their I forgot what they ended up
27.
What did it? 27. Yeah, I was at. I forgot exactly which one it was. The Bulls were at, and it was just like every possession was like, Game 7 of the NBA Finals, because that was, in the regular season, that was as close as you were going to get to like a huge moment. Everybody wanted to knock them off or whatever, and I can't imagine this, especially when you have, because the Bulls were just kind of, they were what they were, whereas you have, a Kareem, you just have these two titans going up against one another. I can't imagine how great it was to be there live. But no, you can tell from the video, it's a fascinating game.
Yeah, and you basically, there's seeing the battle between Wilt and Kareem is fascinating, and also between Jerry West and Oscar Robertson is really fascinating. There's some good play there. I mean, it's a fun game to watch. They
have a great contrast, those two teams. I mean, in terms of like matchups and that sort of stuff, where you a lot of times you don't. It's gonna be hard pressed to have two of the best big men ever going up against each other, and then also two of the best guards. You know what I mean? Like, it's very rare that a team will have two of those guys on there, at a time. So the contrast is very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the playoffs, they beat the Warriors again, but then they meet the Lakers again, but they end up falling in 6 games to the Lakers. But I mean, again, they're a 69-win team. It's kind of hard to it's sort of hard to say, well, even though these Bucks are one of the, another, just basically two of the greatest teams of all time, at least individual teams in a season, battling up against each other, it's hard to fault the second best team for falling in that playoff series. But, so we move on to one thing we want to mention is a couple of things from 72 is that draft, they actually draft Julius Erving. They had the draft rights to Dr. J. He'd already played a season in the ABA. Yeah, he'd already played a season. He played a season with the Virginia Squires. He was trying to get out of that contract, and he even actually practiced and played some exhibition games with the Hawks with Pete Maravich. And there's stuff in Julius Erving's book. There's a excerpt of it on Deadspin that has more of the story. So, but he was challenged in court by the Squires and was even challenged by, of course, the Bucks, who had his draft rights. So that's kind of a complex situation. But I just imagine, like, if they had been able to get Dr. J and add him to that team, I mean, that basically, like, there's your dynasty for the rest of the 70s.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, who knows if Kareem still makes that? I mean, Kareem made that choice for a lot of personal reasons, and although he did say that like later on, he said that one reason for it was that he was kind of frustrated with the direction of the team. So if they had Dr. J, that's probably not going to be an issue. Now, who knows how Dr. J's game evolves in that environment. I mean, I'm sure he's still awesome, but but is it the same, does he have the same role? Is he able to kind of still do a lot of the same stuff? I mean, I'm sure it would have been fine, but there's still, of course, you don't know how things unfold in that situation, but still.
It's not totally fair just to extrapolate, what Dr. J became and put that on the Bucks, but yeah, you'd have to imagine at least be somewhat close to what we sort of got with him.
Yeah,
maybe he's not scoring, 30 plus a game, but yeah, I mean,
he certainly
still just
boosts them in terms of athleticism, and I think with that talent you make it work.
Sure, certainly.
Yes, he also makes his film debut in a fight scene in the 1972 Bruce Lee film Game of Death.
Did you watch this fight scene?
I did. I think I've seen it before, but I did not rewatch it for the podcast.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
He doesn't like. I don't know why they had to use Kareem in it though.
Well, I mean,
it could have just been anybody. I guess
just for fun. I guess
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they had met when Kareem was at UCLA. I believe Bruce Lee was his martial arts teacher. So, they had that relationship, and Kareem gets to be in the movie. So
I wish Bruce Lee was my martial arts teacher.
Yes, that would be nice. Yeah, he's a pretty good
teacher.
Yeah.
He's a good guy to learn from.
Yeah,
I guess.
not too bad. So this is sort of so we move on to the 73 season. Is their third consecutive 60 plus win. Well, they win 60 games, but more than 60 or more wins in a season. They are still amazing. Like every year in the last couple of years, they've been either first or second in offense and defense. This year they slipped to fifth in offense. They're second in defense, so they're still really great. But there is a noticeable tiny slippage there, and they end up again meeting the Warriors in the playoffs for the third consecutive year, but this year the Warriors actually upset them. The Warriors are
fighting berries. Yes.
Yeah, they're only like 47-35. The Warriors are. They have Nate Thurmond, who, again, as we mentioned, always kind of gave Kareem trouble, and a returning Rick Barry. And Kareem, for whatever reason, during this series, just did not play well. Shot way below his normal average. His true shooting percentage was 447. So
Oof.
yeah, so yeah,
and he only averaged 22 points per game, or 22.8 points per game, which is
his PER was
good, but
his PER was
Kareem,
down.
no.
For whatever reason, for the most part he was great in the playoffs, but that year it was definitely a noticeable slippage. So
I mean, there's no reason that he should have 1 point per game more than Oscar Robertson. What I mean?
Not that Oscar time wasn't very good, but it's sort of a strange thing to have happen when he outscored. He had 30 points during the season. Oscar had 15 during the season. So and Oscar was 34.
That's how you kind of assume the breakdown would go, not 22-21. I mean, that's very strange.
Exactly. The Bucks won 14 straight games to end the season to equal the Lakers' record, and the NBA wanted to do a tie-breaking game, but the Players Association said no. So Milwaukee ended up winning a coin flip to get the seed.
And Milwaukee and their coins.
Yes, they do well in the coin flip. The 73 and 74 season, they are only 59-23, so they end that streak of 60 win seasons. But they're first in offensive rating, second in defensive rating. They run through the Lakers and Bulls in the playoffs. They finally do not play the Warriors in the playoffs, so they do play the Lakers again, and they beat those teams pretty handily, but then they fall to the Celtics in 7 games. And Kareem hits a big skyhook in Game 6, after 2 overtimes to win Game 6 in Boston, but they fall in Game 7. Now they do. Lucius Allen is injured during the postseason, so they kind of their guard play is less because of that. It's one of the reasons why they do. And it was kind of interesting because the they kind of talk about there's another great SI article sort of comparing Kareem and Dave Cowens, and Cowens is sort of a little bit, he's undersized of course compared to Kareem, but he can shoot a bit from the outside, forcing Kareem to go away from the paint and defend outside a little bit, but he doesn't want to stray too far because of course his ability to prevent other people from getting the paint is one reason why he's so valuable. So, but they talk about how they the Celtics kind of play the old, like, really fast-paced Celtics game where other teams, and not specifically the Bucks, but a lot of other teams, particularly the Knicks, started kind of playing more conservative, walk the ball up the floor strategy. And,
that is one thing, real quick before we get it. When you watch these 70s, tapes and videos, you notice just how quick the game is and how, you watch today's basketball and you don't realize how much they value possessions and not wanting turnovers. Where in the 70s, it's really, you watch the 80s too, and it's a lot of the same way when you watch kind of the Showtime Lakers or whatever. It's really just about getting up the court as fast as humanly possible and getting a shot up as quick. So we talk about, how amazing it was to have, the Phoenix Suns, or we talked about it on our Steve Nash podcast, how he took the NBA out of by going quick or whatever. And you watch the 70s and it's like the same thing. I mean, these dudes are just like flying, especially these Bucks teams. They're flying down the court and then taking an 18-footer and it's off, and they're just running back down and just like throwing the ball anywhere. And like you watch it almost looks like a current high school game the way they're doing it. I mean, people fall into traps. They just start running and turnovers. And it's just funny to see sometimes, how 70s basketball was sort of played and how much different it is these days and how more methodical about, possessions and ball handling and turnovers they are today than they were, then. But still fascinating to see the difference between the two.
Absolutely.
Two teams here.
And there's kind of an interesting note about the series is that it says, the Bucks have won 248 games in the last 4 years with a strictly ordinary supporting cast. Only the absent Lucius Allen, and forward Bob Dandridge are above average. Average being about all that can be said for Robertson since he turned 35. So that's kind of an interesting perception of the Bucks themselves. I mean, at this point, John McLaughlin is toward the end of his career. They still have Curtis Perry, who's only 25 and is pretty good, but definitely, if you look like in terms of PER, I mean, basically, yeah. Actually, Oscar had only a 14.2 PER his last season. So basically, yeah. I mean, Kareem, Lucius Allen, Bob Dandridge, and Mickey Davis, who played about 1,000 minutes, is a 15.5 PER. Not the PER is perfect, description, but for shorthand, John McLaughlin's is only 12, and as far as heavy minutes guys, so Oscar, Curtis Perry, and all them, they're below average in those terms. So, I mean, there's at least some weight to what they're saying there,
Yes.
They were definitely at this point, they still had a SRS of 7.61, which is still really great, but they're no longer historically great. This is sort of an odd team to, of all the teams, the two teams before that didn't make the finals, this is sort of an odd team to have made it, even though they were still pretty good. And I do believe they had I don't know if they had the best record in the, double check whether they had the best record in the league or yes, they did have the best record in the league. And another thing that's sort of interesting here is like the previous couple of years, there's a big split. There's like these gaudy win totals in the Bucks, mostly responsible for that Lakers team obviously too, and the Celtics, I believe the previous season were a 68 win team, even though they didn't win the finals. But starting this year and going through most of the rest of the 70s, there are few, if any, 60-win teams during that time, but there's almost none. But the worst records, are like mid-20s. So there's an extreme amount of parity over these next few seasons, which is really interesting. And part of it, I think it's amped up once the ABA and the NBA merge, but it even happened before then. And it's hard to exactly know why. I mean, expansion has at least have something to do with it. This is the only time that's really happened, at least since the very early days of the NBA.
Yeah, where you got that much, and it's kind of famous for that, and we've talked about it a little bit, but yeah, it'd be interesting to see if anybody had done really extensive work on what sort of creative paradigm. I mean, the easy answer would be probably expansion happened that way, and it just could have been the dispersal of talent. Sometimes it just sort of happens that way, without any real factors happening, where you just have a few. I mean, it could be a lack of superstars. I mean, you could honestly say that could be it. I don't know if that's necessarily it, but there could be that, or there could just be superstars somehow just being on different teams. It's very interesting. Yeah, I'd be very interested to see someone
and there's a lot of big playoff upsets in the decade as well.
Yeah, and that's huge. And you wonder if that sort of played into is that the kind of causal, or is that it's very interesting. Yeah, I'd like to see someone do a little bit more work and do a little bit more statistical work on exactly why there was so much parity in that era. But there's a number of different factors. But yeah, I don't know of any one that's really stronger than the other.
Yeah. So Oscar retires, and there's an article in the Milwaukee Journal from right before the season beginning where you ask, will Oscar be missed? Kareem says, well, maybe not as much as people think, because we'll have more flexibility and speed. There's also a lot of hype about him playing Bill Walton for the first time. Walton, of course, being the great UCLA star after Kareem, and them finally playing in the pros. In fact, their first exhibition game drew a sellout crowd of 13,000 in Dayton, Ohio, of all places. I don't know why they'd be playing, because usually,
it's nowhere near any of their teams.
Right, yeah. I mean, obviously it's not uncommon.
Green Bay. It's not Green Bay, or it's not Eau Claire,
whatever teams, whatever city is near Portland. Yeah, or even in California, or I don't know. I mean,
Los Angeles,
right?
UCLA, at the UCLA's campus, it's
very strange.
Ohio.
Yeah, right. So,
good for Dayton.
Yeah. And this is the night before Kareem actually breaks his hand, and he does that during an exhibition game with against the Celtics. Don Nelson scratches his eyeball, and he's had several already of times where his eye has been injured, and then he punched the backboard post in frustration and broke his right hand. So it was definitely not a good start to the season.
No,
and basically, they play terrible without Kareem. They start 1-13. They end up being 3-13 once Kareem comes back, but they're not that much better with him. I mean, they're 35-31. They end up 38-44 on the season. Basically, the only good players left are Dandridge. McLaughlin's okay, but as we mentioned, already aging. And then they trade Lucius Allen for Jim Price to the Lakers, and Jim Price ends up being pretty good for them. He's an all-star that season, but other than that, they're kind of young, but they just don't, for whatever reason, they're just not that great. Kareem, the totals are down a bit because he only plays 65 games that season. The shooting percentage is down a bit too. It's 513, which is, other than his final season, is his career low.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, it's not terrible, but it's just, he's still,
for Kareem,
it's obviously,
context,
it's second worst, right? So he's still really good, but definitely it's a down season for him. And then there's a SI article where when he returns from his broken hand. And it makes note here where apparently Oscar was going to come back, but the Bucks tried to rewrite his contract. Basically wanted to take a no-cut clause out of the contract so they could put him on the expansion list if there is one. And then Robinson he said Robertson elected instead to expand to CBS as a color analyst. So, and then they talk about, he comes back with goggles. They mention the goggles. They're like shatterproof plexiglass. The first pair weren't wide enough, and I've seen a picture of them, and they're like they're black, and then they have these big circles. They're not the classic ones that he ends up wearing for most of the rest of his career. They're really big. They almost look like scuba gear,
Yeah, they're very odd. Yeah,
yeah.
He would have done well in today's modern. I mean, you look at the goggles now, and they're just so much better. Where his are just like those look like they would like fog up the ones he had, and I did that. I always feel like they did every. I always remember seeing him. You kind of take them off and mess with them and play with them and stuff. But yeah, that's
yeah.
And there's the goggles. Yeah, I always loved it. I mean, are you a bigger non-goggle or goggle Kareem fan?
Well, I don't know. I mean, they're both.
We need to answer this
they're
now.
both pretty great. I don't know. I need some time to ponder.
Unacceptable. Right now.
I'll give you an answer by the end of the show.
Okay.
So a couple other notes. There's a story of Kareem forgetting to pack his goggles, and like one of the trainers has to like go to his apartment, and they can't, and they're not, and he can't find them, and he has to like call, and they're like playing the game, and he like calls to like the floor, and is talking to somebody on the floor. It's like, we're in the middle of the game now, and he's like, I can't find him, and they eventually find him in Kareem's car, and they bring them back. And then there's also like frustration, by Bob Dandridge with Costello, who was also, he's been there with the Bucks since '69, which is like Kareem was there, and then he's and there's a quote before then from Costello saying, "Oh, my system's easy. It's not that bad." And then he's like, "Yeah, what seems very easy to him is very difficult for a lot of players." It's just very confusing to new players, and they have so many new guys who's coming in. There's so many, the basic offense hasn't changed, but there's so many options, so it is confusing people. So it's just an illustration of like, hey, the coach and the team aren't necessarily on the same page. And I found where like with teams that have been together for quite a long time, coach and player, it just like there does seem to be like eventually that frustration, that stuff does boil over, especially when you're having a season where you're playing such a disappointing level. So.
Yeah. And that happens with, I mean, you really look at the coaches in NBA history, and it's very telling. I don't know if we discussed this on a podcast or not, but you look at the tenures, and it's like Sloan and Popovich, and there's a few others, but really, even the best coaches, they just, at some point, guys need to change, teams need to change, franchises need to change. I mean, it's not like you would assume where these guys are there for, I mean, being there for 10 years is not really the common thing. I mean, it's more the 6 to 7 years is about where most of these guys end up going, and there's a few here and there in history, but yeah, it's very rare that guys really stick around forever. It just doesn't work. I mean, when you go between transitions of franchises and players or whatever, it always seems to get a little odd, and we've seen that even with the best coaches. I mean, Popovich is about the only one who's really, just because really, I mean, his teams haven't transitioned much, and Sloan obviously, but there was a lot of, I mean, we saw Sloan. I mean, Sloan probably could still be here, but the transition from a Malone and Stockton to Darren Williams or whatever was too much for him to kind of work out either. So it's interesting.
Yeah, well, it's funny because Larry Costello, who has led, who had 5+ seasons of 50+ wins, and led one of the greatest teams of all time, has 2 more or 2.5 or like 2.25 more years with the Bucks after this, and then has 1 season with the Bulls, not even a full season with the Bulls, and then his NBA coaching career is done. He coaches college for a long time, I believe. I think Niagara University, where he went to college, but other than that, I mean, it's like a guy who would think, oh, he had a few more options in college, and showed some initiative and some inventiveness as a coach. I mean, his career ended not that much longer, so it just, that sort of adds to your point, I think.
Yeah, it's always, NBA coaching is weird, and it's just a grind too. I mean,
absolutely.
Some of these guys, man, they just like you see, there's certain guys, and I was talking with a buddy the other day, and he's talking about how Steve Kerr has lost so much weight, and then you look at NBA coaches, and they either do 2 things: they either the first few years that they start coaching, or they get back into the coaching ranks, they either lose like 20 pounds in like 2 weeks or whatever. Like Doug Collins coaching and Doug Collins like announcer are like 2 different humans, because like you can tell the guy just doesn't eat. He's probably just watching tape all day, or they get really fat because they just like garbage food while they're watching tape or whatever. But it's always funny that like NBA coaches just like I'm sure it's a fascinating job, but man, it's just such a grind.
Absolutely.
On a day-to-day basis. I mean, just watching tape, studying, coaching, traveling, it's insane.
NBA coaching is hard. You heard it here first.
Yeah.